If you want to help Myth Vision Podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Dr. Price, on Facebook, Chris Palmero asks, "You've done a lot of great recordings with him. I was wondering if there was one he had discussing the Samaritan religious beliefs. For example, I learned that their worship of the great god Sem may have been the source of Simon Magus." And with that being said, maybe you can talk about what the Samaritans believed. Maybe you have some insight you can shed on us, and then we'll get into the Samaritan woman at the well maybe a little, and get your opinion on what maybe John's doing with that. So first off, I guess, the worship of the god Sem, and maybe something to do with Simon Magus and the Samaritans.
The only thing I know about that, if it is, it sounds similar, is that it used to be said that the worship of Simon Magus as a divine incarnation had gone so far as Rome, where in the Acts of Peter, Peter and Simon have a miracle contest, and Simon, feigning an ability to fly with a crane and so on, crashes to his death. A scene that also occurs in the Toledoth Yeshu, where it's Judas and Jesus, and also in the Dr. Faustus story. It's interesting, it pops up all over the place. But some then pointed out more recently that this may have been based, this claim that Simonianism had penetrated Rome, could be based on a misreading of the base of a statue of a god who was called Simo Sanctus, the Holy Simo. And that could be this god, but that it had nothing to do with Simon Magus. Somebody just mistook the one for the other. I don't know whether that's true or not. But originally, Samaritanism was a type of Judaism, though before that term would have been used. And in the Bible, the origin was during the split after the death of Solomon, when his son Rehoboam took the throne and alienated the northern tribes. There had always been trouble. They seceded twice under King David. Of course, this is all story, apparently is not based on historical fact, but the way the story reads, especially since, as Russell Gamirkan has pointed out, that Solomon almost certainly must have been a Hebrew version of Shalmaneser III, I think it was, the Assyrian emperor. But at any rate, the story says that Solomon, who had been conscripting Israelites to build the temple, that he was really a kind of a tyrant, and that the northern tribes were sick of it, and they managed to bring back a revolutionary named Jeroboam, who had to flee to Egypt during one of these uprisings. They brought him back and made him their emissary, and he goes into the council chamber and says, "I'm representing the northern tribes. We'll stick with you if you will promise to ease up on the lash that your father wielded. Give us a break." And he said, "Well, come back tomorrow. I'll consult with my counselors," and he does. And the older gents in the council said, "They're right. You don't want to tick them off. Let's ease up." But the younger one says, "No, that'll make you look weak." Like John Lindsay and the unions in New York in the 60s. You better reinforce the strictness of your father. And so he decides to go with them. And so Rehoboam comes out the next day and he said, "If you thought my father whipped you with lashes, I will whip you with scorpion tails." And because my little finger is thicker than my father's penis. It isn't translated literally in Bibles. And I think the King James says thicker than my father's loins. but that's not what it says. And so they say, okay, to hell with you. O Israel, what inheritance do we have in the house of David? We leave you to yourselves, and they start their own kingdom. And which is okay with God, because he wasn't too thrilled with Solomon by having all these foreign wives and building chapels to their gods and so on. Well, supposedly from that day on, their forms of Hebrew religion began to diverge gradually. And then the big blow was when Assyria conquered the northern kingdom and made it a big province of the Assyrian Empire. And Samaria, which had been the capital city, became the name of the whole thing. And they deported a whole bunch of the Samaritans and relocated other conquered peoples, which is what they did in those days. And so the non-Israelites got assimilated into the population of northern kingdom Israelites who were left. And the story goes that they brought in pagan elements from their old religion, which is not improbable at all. But Samaritanism certainly thought of itself as Judaism, but there were a couple of differences. I'm sure there were various kosher and other differences, but they repudiated Jerusalem. But Jeroboam knew that some of them would be nostalgic to go to the Jerusalem Temple of Solomon for a great festival. So he said, okay, we got to put a stop to that. We'll build our own temple here in Bethel, the house of El, the house of God, and so on. And he said, okay, this is where you're going. He has a golden calf set up. He says, behold, Israel, your God who led you out of Egypt. And that story gets transferred to Aaron and the golden calf and so on. Well, then that got destroyed and they replaced it with Dan. And then that got destroyed and they rebuilt Bethel. But all this time they worshipped at Mount Gerizim, which had been the site of one of the pre-Solomon temples. It was a holy place even in ruins. Well, no, they still had a temple there. But during the time of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, there was strife between the two groups, Judea now being independent, and they went and demolished the temple of Gerizim, and boy, did the tensions mount then. And it was like a Cold War between the two groups. And when in John 4, the Samaritan woman said, your fathers say we ought to worship in Jerusalem, but our fathers worshipped on this mountain. And Jesus says, well, from now on, it's not going to matter where you worship. God seeks those to worship him in spirit and in truth, and so on. So that's this mountain, Mount Gerizim. Earlier in the story, Jesus is tired. He's by a well, Jacob's well, oddly enough, not mentioned in the Old Testament, just a typical, local folklore kind of association. Washington slept here. It's odd because we're not sure why the Samaritans would have been interested in Jacob, who's considered, I guess he was their father too, ultimately. But anyway, Jesus says, I'm thirsty, could you give me a drink? And she says, what? You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. I can't give you a drink. And John says, that's because they don't use the same dishes. They hate each other so much. You're not kosher. I don't care what you're having or what's on the dish. Sorry. This is borrowed from a Buddhist story where Ananda, the disciple of the Buddha, is tired. He goes to a well. A woman from a lower caste is dipping the bucket, and he says, may I have a drink? And she says, I'm sorry, I'm from a lower caste. I can't let you use the...
Wow.
And Ananda says, my sister, I'm not asking what caste you are. I'm just asking you for a drink of water. I mean, as Bultmann said, that's got to be the origin of that story. Anyway, I'm sorry to do all this distraction. But yeah, that was one thing. They couldn't use the same dishes, etc. Okay, let's see.
You have
One-
married 5 husbands.
Yeah, I'm getting to that in a
Okay,
second.
okay, I'm screwing you up.
They didn't believe in the coming of a Davidic Messiah and wouldn't have called him the Messiah, the anointed king from David's line. No, they had repudiated David. There's no way they would want another Davidic king coming back. What they wanted was the Taheb, the restorer, who would come back and reveal where I think Jeremiah had supposedly hidden the vessels of the temple to get them away from Nebuchadnezzar, if he did. So that would mark the end times. In fact, eventually Pilate had a bunch of Samaritans killed who gathered at the mountain thinking that the Taheb was about to come. What a mess. That got Pilate recalled to Rome. They wouldn't stand for that kind of cruelty. Well, so no, what John is mistaken when he has the Samaritan woman say, well, I know that the Messiah's coming. He'll explain everything. No, she wouldn't have said that. But he's trying to fuse the two together because ultimately he's trying to co-opt the Samaritans and make them Christians. Same kind of thing he does to John the Baptist. Well, the canon of Scripture was different also. They just had the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, because the Taheb would be like a new Moses, or even they later thought Moses himself in a second coming. And so they only venerated the books of Moses. They had their own book of Joshua, which is sort of semi-canonical and not much like the standard book of Joshua. But of course they're not going to be interested in anything that culminates in David or anything like that, or has to do with the Jerusalem temple. To hell with that. So they have a smaller canon. They have commentaries on it and so on. But that was a big difference. Now, where does Simon Magus fit into it? He was a miracle worker and a mystagogue who claimed to be, from what we're told, basically an incarnation of God. He was the great power, which pretty much meant in the lingo of the day he was God incarnate. And he had come to earth in search of his fallen consort, the Ennoia or Epinoia, who was the first thought of the Godhead, like the Logos. She had fallen into the material world. That was the old Gnostic idea of the fallen Sophia, trapped in the world of matter, and which is a messy, yucky, terrible place. And she had been incarnated many times, once as Helen of Troy. And in Simon's day, when he finally found her, she was also called Helen, but he had to rescue her from a brothel, just like Travis Bickle in the Cab and Taxi Driver. He rescues her, and she went around with him as his consort, and he would say, we are the divine emanations, and we preach. It says the angels created the world, not I didn't, as the chief God. And I proclaim to you, you can be saved through faith, not the works of the law. And I appeared previously in the previous generation in Judea, and seemed to be crucified, though I suffer. I didn't actually suffer. So he's claiming to be Simon of Cyrene, who had substituted for Jesus. You can kind of connect the dots that way. And this gets really interesting in terms of connecting dots. Simon is said to be a Samaritan from the town of Gitta, or that's Greek, in Hebrew is Gath. This is where Goliath was from. It was one of the 5 Philistine city-states: Ekron, Ashdod, Gath, 2 other ones, can't remember at the moment. And that became Samaria when it was conquered. So he's a Samaritan, but there's also a tradition that he was more of a Philistine. Though that kind of makes sense, since Goliath and the Philistines had lived there too. And Gitta could denote the Kittim, who were mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the sea people who had invaded, probably the Philistines, who were Greeks basically, and Simon of Cyrene. Where is Cyrene? It's a North African Philistine colony. And so is Simon of Cyrene and Simon of Gitta, are they the same guy? Well, I think they were. And the story has been broken up over time. And so, at any rate, Simon of Gitta becomes a magician, and they imply in the books he's in, like Gospel, Acts of Peter and stuff like that, that he did use trickery, but that he also drew on ghosts and demons to work his effects. But that's not the same thing as being God incarnate, so they figured he was a charlatan in any way you looked at it. And Acts says that most of the Samaritans had gone over to his religion. And Justin Martyr says the same thing, that most Samaritans today, around 175, are Simonians. Is that true? We don't know. I mean, it could be true, and it kind of died out because Samaritanism today, which still exists, is a kind of variant form of Judaism. And these are the big differences, the canon of Scripture and the eschatology, the idea of the Taheb. But they get along fine with Jews. There are not many of them, but it's considered, they speak of Israel, Judea and Samaria as part of the state of Israel today. So no hard feelings anymore. Now, where does this put the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4? Well, I think it is an attempt to co-opt the Samaritans, because what happens after this uncomfortable chat with Jesus? Why don't you go ask your husband? Which one? And he says, well, look, you're not fooling me. I happen to know you've had 5 husbands, like Elizabeth Taylor. And you're shacking up with some guy who you're not even married to now. And so she is pretty stunned. How does he know this? Like a California psychic on the phone. And so she says, well, let me take a break. I'll be right back. And she goes to the village and says, you're never going to believe this. I met this guy who told me everything I ever did. Don't you think he's the Messiah or the whatever? And they say, well, let us check him out. And she leads the whole bunch of them back there, and he must teach them something or other. And they say, well, we don't even need to take your word. We've seen for ourselves. This guy is the real thing. He's the Son of God. And in the aftermath of this, Jesus says to the disciples, look, others have prepared the ground, but you're going to harvest it. What's he talking about? Well, the post-Jesus Samaritan mission that you read about in Acts. Why does she have the 5 husbands? What's the conceivable relevance of that? Well, it's because she is Helen. And originally the story depicted her with not with Jesus, but with Dositheus the Samaritan, another Gnostic guru who was associated with Simon and the Pseudo-Clementines. They say that John the Baptist was the leader of a sect that was limited to 30 men. And when he died, there was a debate about who should be his successor. The 2 nominees were Simon Magus and Dositheus the Samaritan. And they had a miracle contest, and Dositheus won. So Simon stalked off and started his own vastly more successful franchise. And that was the beginning of Gnosticism. Well, I think that this is a Dosithian story, because they did last long, too. In this, what does Jesus say? If you knew who it was you're talking to and recognized the gift of God, you would have asked him for a drink, and he'd give you water that springs up to eternal life. The gift of God, that's exactly the meaning of the name Dositheus. Is he saying, if you knew who I am, Dositheus, you'd know what I can offer you? And who is she? She's Helena. And the previous husbands are the men that exploited her during her previous incarnations. It seems to me, I could be wrong, but I just don't think these things are mere coincidences.
That reminds me of the mimetic connection that Dr. McDonald did when he says the woman who should be spoken of far and wide in the Gospels. That Greek phrase for far and wide is actually the name of the woman that suckled Odysseus.
Oh, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, so that sounds like a connection, and that's what fascinates me so much about these Gospels. Like, people go, why are you still obsessed with studying them? Dude, can you not see how interesting it is?
Yes.
If you find the Odyssey in the Gospels and then find Simon Magus and Helena material possibly. I mean, what if you're right? I'm not sure. I'm just saying, that would blow me away to say that. But I have heard, and we'll close out with this, maybe my audience has heard this as well, that you have had 5 husbands thing is 5 nations. I've heard this kind of idea that, like, supposedly this is symbolic in that, she, Israel, which they're painting Samaria, the Samaritan woman, as Israel rather than Judea or whatever. I don't know how to, historically that wouldn't make sense here, but let's just say that's the case. You had been married to Egypt, Assyria, Medo-Persia, Babylon, Greece, the 5, and now the one you're with, Rome, is not your husband. This is like one interpretation someone told me is like nations, and that now the one you're with is not your husband, Rome. You think he's your husband, but he's not your husband. And it's kind of this picture of, well, your husband's Jesus Christ. It's me, the one you're not even realizing right in front of you. That there's the marriage coming, there's the lamb, the wedding. Anyway, I don't know, but I wonder if because it doesn't have to be, in my view, one only explanation. I wonder if there's a combination of things, because, for example, in another interpretation you mentioned earlier, talking about the woman at the well in Buddhism, okay, and Buddha comes to the well and all that, and you're a different caste. Well, we do see some type of narrative from Jacob at the well in the Old Testament, and that was Jacob's well, where he comes up, and then the woman that was his love, that he falls in love with, is like, ooh, you are gorgeous and you are extra special. I want you. And then he gets tricked, and he gets super drunk 7 years into it, and then he has to work 7 more years. Or you could also look at Moses.
That's right.
So many stories. And, can it be one or the other, or does it have to be one or the other? Or could these stories, even the one with Helena, be borrowing from some of these stories?
Sure, yes.
So,
Robert Alter, in his book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, talks about type scenes that are repeated again and again, and there's even more versions than this. And Thomas L. Brody, what a genius this guy is. He's a Roman Catholic monk and a mythicist, and he hasn't been burned at the stake yet. He shows that there are several. He's big on the mimesis thing, just like Dennis MacDonald, and he shows again and again in astonishing detail how you can see these Old Testament scenes rewritten and reshuffled several times in the Gospels. And once he points them out, like the story of Ananias and Sapphira, is a combination of the story of Naboth's vineyard with Ahab and Jezebel, and the story of Achan stealing that garment from the booty of the conquest of Ai and getting stoned and so on. Once you read it, you can't forget it. It's like, yeah, that has to be the case. And there's a bunch of other ones, like the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. That gets broken up and rewritten several times. At least it looks that way. And it was this kind of thing that really pushed me over the line into mythicism.
Yep. That was my origins. I came out of full preterism heading in the direction of mythicism because I saw so much literary, like, your God is so big. Like, once you start seeing the patterns and you see the connections and you see how much of this literary device and types and such are used. I mean, my last, I guess you say, before I stepped out of full preterism and Christianity, was giving a lecture on why the New Testament was the end. It was supposed to be the fulfillment, because it was the third time this huge wave of law, then prophets, then here's the culmination, the Messiah. And you had Moses, Joshua, Elijah, Elisha, and then Jesus and the church, or John the Baptist and Jesus, however you'd like to connect it, but I would say Jesus and the church. Because the church, he says, you'll do many more miracles than me. Well, Elijah says, you'll do, what do you want? And Elisha says, give me twice. I want double what you've done. Oh, well, he performed 16 miracles instead of 8. Mm-hmm. Or Joshua, he conquers the very thing that Moses never was able to do. So I saw this, and I was like, oh, there's a pattern here. And the pattern's what really started to make me go, did this really happen? Or is this a creation? Is it? And I actually plan on doing videos on Myth Vision at some point, going down the mimesis thing and doing my Joseph story again, but this time really narrating it with good graphics and edit it to where it's like this at the beginning, kind of a narrator. Ladies and gentlemen, what makes more sense? That someone after the fact wrote an amazing tale out of these already existing stories, or this all literally happened and this is true. You be the judge at the end of this. Now Joseph. And then to take them into the story and show the connections and show all these parallels.
That's great.
Yeah, and then of course Osiris and all that. It's like, what the? So, yeah.
In Acts, the same sort of thing with the several parallels between Peter and Paul, and weird ones that stick out like sore thumbs, and miraculous escapes from prison, raising a dead guy, raising a lame guy, and so on and so on. The handkerchiefs and the shadow, and is this just coincidence, or are we not dealing with an artificial thing? This guy, how do you say it, Austin Farrer?
Farrer, yeah. Farrer.
He made an interesting point decades ago that the more artistic a narrative appears to be, the less historical it probably is. And that's right. In fact, there's stuff in there. It's amazing we don't notice this. But Kate Hamburger, believe it or not, she's from Hamburg, I guess, she did this thing called The Logic of Literature, where she showed how a lot of narrative couldn't possibly be history because it describes scenes of action that no one could have recorded. That they might have known what happened at a meeting, but they're describing it as if they were there, and it's because they're novelizing. How do we not notice this? The narrative can be such a charm and so seductive that we just get sucked right into it and don't notice the kind of thing we're reading.